In Malcolm Gladwell's Talking to Strangers, we learn that talking to strangers isn't always easy. So should we even do it? Welcome to Painted Porch Strategies Book Club, book number 2 in our book club. Thank you for following along. This is going to be a very interesting one because we're only doing part 1 today, the first part of the book. It's clearly easier to see Sierra's than it is mine with the coloring here. But Malcolm Gladwell is he's regarded as one of the great thinkers out there that challenges us when you pick up one of his books. So my name is Rob. This is Amy, and right over there is Sierra. So ladies, I want to start with you and find out your immediate takeaways in book 1 with that idea in mind. Talking to strangers isn't easy. What did you take away from part 1? Sierra, we'll start with you.
Well, I wasn't familiar with Malcolm Gladwell's writing. This is the first of his books that I've written. I was aware of him as a person, but not as haven't read his stuff. It was very interesting the way that he set this up. He set up why he was really intrigued by this. And I love how, Rob, I'm sure you'll touch on this, even says, and then we all kind of stopped thinking about it, but I never stopped thinking about it. So this idea of talking to strangers, and some of his ideas are not necessarily what you would expect. I've been surprised.
I would agree. Originally, I remember when I first picked up this book, I thought, this might be a book about like a how-to, if you will, of how to talk to strangers, or here's some tips to keep in mind. But Gladwell is not that obvious with the way he presents it. He weaves some great narrative stories. He tells it all through different examples, through different stories of instances or events in history where the two people or the people that were talking to each other were in fact strangers, and they were not necessarily hearing each other well. So I love the way he presents that because it gets you to think about it a little bit differently. And I love that he puts it in a narrative format, because then you in some ways, while you did not experience that, you can see that perspective. And I think he's wonderful with doing that. So that's my initial takeaway so far. I love it so far. I'm like wanting to keep reading, but I'm trying to pace myself.
Well, I think it's a story about the complexity of human relationships. Yeah. Is really what it is. So it starts off, he tells you the story of Sandra Bland. Sandra Bland in Texas was pulled over by a police officer for failure to use her directional signal, Blinka, as we call it up in Massachusetts, where I'm from. And they get into this interaction that gets more and more heated because Sandra Bland, who is in the car, is wondering why the police officer wants her to get out of the car. She's like, for a directional signal? And at one point she starts smoking a cigarette, and the cop seemingly gets more frustrated, tries to pull her out of the car, threatens to tase her, ends up arresting her, putting her in jail. In that jail cell, she ended up killing herself. So it's this mystery as to how something like that can happen. So he starts us off with that story, which was a big news story a few years ago. And then he kind of goes back to the beginning about these other examples where things go awry in meetings. So he uses 2 examples in part 1. First, the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, had a whole bunch of spies down there in Cuba. And I don't want to give away all of it, but let's just say this in a generic way. The CIA was fooled by Fidel Castro in Cuba. And the second example is Neville Chamberlain, who was the Prime Minister of England in the 30s, right, leading up to World War II. He was the only one that went and met Hitler, a couple other people too, but Hitler was able to fool him too. So that is where we're going right off the bat, is the psychology of human interactions can go a billion different ways, where you could be Neville Chamberlain, sit down with Hitler and say, what is it you really want? Oh, I just want this section of Czechoslovakia. That's all you want? Yeah, that's all I want. Sign the paper. Great. I mean, for gentlemen like Neville Chamberlain, getting a man to sign a piece of paper is your word is bond. Hitler didn't care about that, obviously. We know what happened in World War II. So what did you guys take away from those 2 examples about interacting with other people and the potential consequences on a high level, at least from a government standpoint.
I will say it's really interesting. I loved one of the key things that seemed to be the through point here with both of these examples in part one was the more you knew someone, it seemed like the more you were able to be deceived, which I thought was really interesting. I'm curious to see how this continues to go, because that was an immediate, oh gosh, okay. So are you more easily susceptible to being fooled the more you know someone than others? Like they give the example with Neville Chamberlain. Number one, he was not, he gets a bad rap. I actually had a very different view of Neville Chamberlain after reading this. He's very often cast aside as a buffoon, as inept. He made the dumbest mistake. He got duped by Hitler. But it's really interesting because, Gladwell even cites two other people who met Hitler from the UK.
From Chamberlain's government.
And they were not like spring chicken. They weren't naive. They were very smart, seasoned diplomats. They understood the rules of foreign policy and all of the players. This wasn't their first rodeo dealing with something like this, and yet they were even fooled. So I found I was a lot more sympathetic to Neville Chamberlain after I read this, realizing, what, he had every reason to believe him, because especially being a businessman, I didn't know he came from the business sector. He's used to making deals and agreements, and those deals and agreements typically, I imagine, are, they're adhered to, they're recognized, they're, yes, sometimes people can go back on their word, but not to the extent of invading Poland.
Different stakes, though.
Yeah.
It's not business.
Yeah.
It's business of a country.
Treated it like business, thinking that they had this agreement in place. How about you, Sierra?
Well, I think what's interesting is there's this, the more you know someone, the more emotionally invested you are. Like, we had a moment, or like you connect with that person, whether or not you like that person, you connect, or you have shared experience. There's that emotional bond. And just like that saying, love is blind, it's like when you are in love or in lust with someone, you often have that proverbial wool pulled over your eyes where you're kind of dazzled, whether it's like just like the power or just the moment, or hey, we're having tea together, or whatever it is. Maybe you're just dazzled into a bond that makes you more trusting. Because if I look back of what I know of like primitive hardwiring is, in primitive times, if somebody was a stranger, until you knew that they were good, you assumed that they were bad. They wanted to kill you, kill your family, take your land, take your stuff, whatever. Like that's the most primitive is somebody you don't know is a threat unless proven trustworthy. So your guard is up with a stranger. And then the stranger often has to kind of earn your trust, or, show that they don't have weapons, show that they're not going to, hunt you down. Right. So that emotional tie, is that what is changing your perception? Is your guard being let down when someone's no longer a stranger?
I'm going to add another layer to that, because I think that is 100% accurate. Yeah. Then you add in the individual, say, my belief system on top of that. So let's go back to Neville Chamberlain for a moment. All he wants to do is avoid a war.
That's his motivation.
Yeah. So he believed that he was averting a war. So everything in that belief system told him he was doing the right thing, most likely, by going to meet with the bad guy, Hitler, by going to, meet with him. And I don't know if he says it in this section, where Hitler gave him the double handshake, the double secret handshake that he only gave to certain people. So again, now a little trickery by Hitler there to say, I can fool this person. And I think that there's two things to be aware of, what Sierra said and what I said, right? When you're talking to a stranger, what are they all about? What's their belief system? See if you can find that out. And that comes into asking questions, not presuming you're going to lead them somewhere, right? And then that second part is being aware of your own beliefs and your own biases that always show up in conversations, because you might have a different opinion about a certain topic, or you might believe in this case, ooh, if I do this, I'll save millions of lives. So all I need to do is get him to sign a paper. That's all it's going to take for me to save lives.
Mm-hmm.
And the unfortunate part of putting yourself in that position, at least when it comes to Neville Chamberlain, is it's so high stakes. You get it wrong, you get looked at the way he's looked at through history. You get it right, you're a hero. And he was greeted as a hero when he came back, until Hitler took over the rest of Czechoslovakia and then invaded Poland and then tried to invade the rest of Europe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. It really does go back to what is your internal belief? What's your motivation? Right. So with Neville Chamberlain, his motivation was peace. So he was going in seeking peace in his mind. I mean, obviously actions too, but in his mind seeking peace. And so peace is what he saw. Peace is what he didn't see some of the other things. And I think that's key when you talk about engaging in conversation. You know, it said that they had many different conversations. The one thing Gladwell doesn't get into, which we can't know, is who was doing most of the talking, who was asking most of the questions. Because I think with that, eventually, I think at some point, someone who is trying to deceive you that much will eventually trip up and reveal their cards if you engage in them in enough or in depth enough of a way. Same thing when it comes to Fidel Castro. You know, those CIA agents, they had a mission and they thought they were kicking ass with it. Mm-hmm. And so that was all they saw. They saw themselves winning. They saw that they were, you know, they were catching them in every turn. And so they didn't see the signs necessarily that maybe were happening around them, that had they just stopped a minute and taken that one step back, remove themselves one level from that situation, taken a different perspective, they may have caught some of those signs.
Right. That ego was clouding their ability to see. Mm-hmm. So there's all these things at play is, you know, where you're coming from or where your experience is or what you want to see. Are you seeing what you wish to see? Are you manifesting it? Another thing that I found interesting that Rob, you didn't even touch on was that whole bit about parole judges, like a judge, whether it's a person judge deciding whether to give somebody parole, you know, that you believe them, that they're going to change, etc. Or then they did this experiment with these computers and they input all this data to try to see if the computers could do better. But really, you look at I actually, as somebody, the statistics bother me on that because I feel like more study could have been done. They don't really outline all of the statistics very well. But I think when you have such a volatile possible outcome, I wonder what even, you know, that over under, there's so many factors at play when you're looking at parole and whether whether a person truly has every intent to do well. Or even when we talk about Hitler, it's well known now that Hitler was an incredible personality that was exuberant, that was charismatic. And someone who is very charismatic is very good at fooling you. And so it's hard to really say in a lot of these situations, there's so many things at play and to think of like you were right or you were wrong. I just think the dichotomy of control kind of really screws up that whole black and white idea.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, that's 100% true. And if you think about, you know, always the what could have been, what should have been with this, in trying to get back to Amy's point about at least Chamberlain tried, right? Instead of looking at him as the fool, what was he supposed to do? Was he supposed to invade Germany in hopes of avoiding a war? I mean, that's the opposite of avoiding a war. So it came down to probably Hitler's intent was what it was. He wanted to create a master race. That was his ultimate guiding light, which is incredibly insane and horrible and evil, but that it is what it is. And that was that part I don't think Chamberlain fully grasped, was what is Hitler's actual guiding light? And that is, I think, where Malcolm Gladwell is going with here, is that in these situations, what is that cop in the Sandra Bland story? What's his guiding light? if his guiding light, if he believes that he's keeping the streets safe or protecting people from bad drivers, and someone gives him attitude about how he's doing his job incorrectly, he might get his tension ramped up a little bit.
Mhm.
Because that's, again, when you take human interactions, there's infinite possibilities. So it's like atoms combining and colliding. Does it make a bomb, or is it completely calm and peaceful like a spa? It's somewhere in between there that we have these interactions with people we don't know, because we don't know anything about them. We don't know about their beliefs. We don't know about their thought process. We don't know if they're nice, or if they have a family, or if they hate kids, whatever the case may be. So you're trying to figure out all of that in high stress, high tension situations. And it can be incredibly difficult. That's why I think he gets to that point that talking to strangers isn't always easy, especially when the stakes get higher.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's one thing if you're in a bar and you're having a conversation with someone.
Sure.
Versus cop civilian interaction,
Mm-hmm.
or heads of state interaction.
Right. And you don't know, even if it's just one person, you don't know what happened to them earlier that day. You don't know where their headspace is. And some people aren't even necessarily clued into that about themselves. Who knows what else is going on in the mind of another person. It's very interesting. I'm really curious to see where part 2 takes us, because he's definitely setting us up. I feel like he's purposely giving us all these different stories, like a pinball. It's like going, pew, 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 pew. And even they talk about Montezuma, and how there was like 2 different translators, and there's a type of meaning this person meant, it got totally lost in translation. I even wonder, like, things like when you send an email or a text message and you're trying to say sarcastic things, and yet not as sarcastic, right? So I feel like he's taking us in all these different directions, sort of to mix us up, to like get us jumbled for something.
Yeah. I love the Cortez Montezuma piece, because I think that is a beautiful setup of they're literally speaking 2 different languages, and all of that, what was lost in translation, and the nuance of it, the subtlety of, I can't remember the actual name of the language, but whatever the language is that Montezuma was speaking and his people, it has that reverential tone to it already. So it sounds like it's capitulation, but it's actually built into the style of the language. And so because of that, it was completely misinterpreted as to what was being said, and then what happened, and the devastation, both to the people and to that country, I don't know, was it a territory? What is it considered? I don't know. A region, just
it was a nation. Back then that was a nation.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So let's kind of put a bow on this, and knowing that this is part 1, there's a couple of more parts to come here in the Painted Porch Strategies book club. Malcolm Gladwell's Talking with Strangers. What are you taking away from this first part that is going to stay with you? Is there anything so far that is a lesson you're like, okay, this is a great thing I learned, I need to put it in my brain and keep it there?
Go ahead.
I would say, I think that the last line of part 1, it's on page 50. If I can convince you of one thing in this book, let it be this: strangers are not easy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I don't know where he's going to go with this, but
yeah,
I'm going to hold on for the ride.
Well, I mean, if you even scroll through the table of contents and the different stories, you're like, woo, this is going to get interesting, as he goes through talking about things like Amanda Knox, Sylvia Plath, Bernie Madoff, Jerry Sandusky. These are not light topics. They're very complicated topics, but that's what I love, that he's unpacking. We sometimes think it's so simple when we're interacting with someone, to your point, Sierra, we have an intuition, we have a gut feeling, but often I think with that, we also need to check ourselves, check our internal biases, check our judgments, check what our motivation and our ego is when we start interacting with strangers. So that way we can better hear and see them. So, and then hopefully through that, they can better hear and see us as well.
I find it to be very interesting that what we do here at Painted Porch Strategies is essentially helping you be aware of what he's talking about in this book, because most of our interactions have to do with us. We're just programmed that way because our body, as Sarah reminds us in her course, Radical Mindfulness, we're always in survival mode in a way. Like our number one job as not only a species, but individuals is to survive. So we're always approaching things from our biases, from our judgments. Now, 40,000 years ago, they served us in a different way than they serve us now. Life is much different than it was back then. We live more collectively. We live in cities. We live in towns around other people. So those instincts don't necessarily apply the same way. So being aware of them and knowing what your biases are will impact how you interact with the world, whether it be a stranger at, say, Walmart, or whether it be, oh, wow, I had a conversation with, well, I'll use a recent example, Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, who has gone all in that the election was stolen. In talking to him, I wanted to know what his belief system was, not mine, not whether I agree with him or not, because quite honestly, in the moment, it doesn't matter. But that is an interaction where I'm going to put all my judgments aside, and I'm just going to ask him, essentially, which I did, why are you doing this? You put your entire reputation, your entire company's reputation on the line for this. Mm-hmm. And his answer was, well, I believe if I don't fight for it, it's gone anyways. So I won't have My Pillow if I don't stand up and fight for this. And again, you can agree or disagree, but put that aside for a moment and think about where he's coming from. Mm-hmm. And that is really what this book is getting into to me, Amy and Sarah, is put yourself aside, unless it's a true life or death situation or a true dangerous situation. But you will know that most likely.
Yeah.
Because you're trying to make it about the other person.
Yeah, I think it goes back to just being curious, right? So often when we engage in conversation, whether it's with strangers or friends or whomever, often we're asking questions to then be able to share to impart our wisdom or our opinions onto them. And through that, you lose, to your exact point, Rob. Like if you had asked him, so why are you doing this? And his responses were giving you then ammo to come back and say, well, here's all the ways that that's wrong. Then you haven't heard him at all. And you are simply approaching it from your lens, your perspective, and you're not actually talking, you're talking at a stranger. You're not talking with or to a stranger, or vice versa. Yeah. So I do want to add one other thing that I loved at the end of the first part, which was the whole word fill in the blanks.
Yes. Oh, yes.
I thought that was so great. And that was such a perfect illustration of how we view ourselves and then how we view others. So when you did that, what were some of your reactions when you did the fill in the blank? Did you see yourself? Did you start
my personal?
Yeah, you personal.
Well, I know that when I did the first few, I had like glad, and like I had all these like very like Sierra kind of words that I filled in. And then I was like, when I read his, I was like, glum. I was like, glum, that wouldn't even. So I think I did have like a judgment, or like it just, and like none of my words were the same as his. So then I was like, oh, did I get this wrong? Or like this person's very different from me. But then as I kept reading, and then they said that people had a completely different view of when it was about themselves, the tendency was, oh, they're just words. It doesn't mean anything. But then when they were asked to judge somebody else's, all of a sudden it was like a big judgment call, right?
Yeah, it means everything. It tells so much about that person.
So much.
The words that they use. They must be an overachiever. They must have had this in their childhood or whatever. It's like,
some of the things people said were so out there. I was like, what? How'd you get this from just these words?
Yeah. But it goes back to, Rob, one of the things that you talk about in Master Your Message, a big piece is language is contagious. And the words that you use, whether intentional or not, they are sending a message to other people, even though, you know, the words that you're choosing to say in your mind, as he talks about here, it doesn't necessarily reflect if you think something is positive or negative or what have you, but the
Right.
way someone receives it, the way that stranger or that other person is interpreting, just like you said, Sierra, you were like, glum. Oh, you know, he had some really deep ones. Hater, you know, attack. Like,
Yeah.
dude, seriously, you know, it's like you immediately think, man, what's going on in this guy's head, right? When it's
I didn't
to him,
think that
it's
at
just
all.
words.
I didn't.
Right.
I just was like, okay, that's what words came to
You
mind.
didn't?
Yeah, I didn't really have a judgment on it. But I also know, you know, in Master Your Message, my course, there are 10 times as many negative words in the English language than there are positive words. So just by happenstance, you're going to pick more negative words because there's more available to you.
Mm-hmm.
And it usually what you do in these exercises is you try to rush through them. So you go with the first thing that comes to mind.
Right, but that's even when you're speaking. Very often you're not necessarily pausing to think, what word choice am I going to use in this conversation? The word comes out, you know, sometimes even before you think about it. So I think that's really key when you recognize how someone might interpret what you're saying, that language is contagious, how you might be sending a message of doubt, negativity, what have you, when you aren't in that state of mind at all. So I think that's a really great lesson here, and it fortifies what you talk about in your program, which is great.
In what way?
That language is contagious.
But
It has
more than
an
just a
impact.
word you say,
It
right?
has an
It's
impact.
about the whole like sentence or paragraph you're constructing.
Yeah.
So if someone, for example, complaining a lot, as the receiver, you're going to notice that this person complains a lot. So if you go beyond the words and you think about the whole context, point being, your interpretations of things often are wrong. And be aware of that. Like you might be thinking, oh, well, this person said this, so their psychology is this.
Right.
You might have that completely wrong because it's based on your belief system interpreting something they said, not necessarily what they meant. Because again, knowing that there are 10 times as many negative words in English. So if someone says negative words, that's kind of what the language is designed to do again, right? Negative words are survival. You describe things as bad or poison or, you know, awful because you're trying to avoid those things.
Mm-hmm.
So that's how I look at it. And I don't know why I'm different from you guys in that
Well, because I think
aspect.
because you've studied it more, which is why you have your program that helps to
show
the rest of we fools, you know,
Okay.
how what we're saying or what we're hearing actually does have an impact to how we then show up and communicate with other people.
100% does.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well,
Yeah,
and I think
that's why you're our master of communication.
That's why you're our MC.
Mhm. But it is very intriguing that you guys had different interpretations than me about that exercise where I've never quite, but I mean, I live in this world too, where I study the news and I read politics and human interactions, and I've had every type of human interaction you possibly could. So I have a different advantage, I guess, than most people don't, or not in my line of work where that's a big part of it. So in looking at these exercises, I've seen them for years. And I always try to break down, I'm like, what does this study really tell us? Because oftentimes you try to, same thing we do with human interactions. Well, this must mean this. I'm like, okay, it's a small sample size, small number of people. And you forget the fact that there are so many negative words in English that we have a predisposition to explain things in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
So if you take that out, he described it negatively. You're like, well, he just used a word.
Mm-hmm.
Dig in a little bit.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that,
cued in.
And I'll end on this note, the Sandra Bland part, right? There were so many other ways that could have ended.
Yeah.
Had they just both been aware of each other and listened to each other versus I'm a cop, I have power, I'm going to take you to jail. And who knows what led her, this poor woman, to take her own life in that jail cell.
No one knows.
All from a blinker. No one should end up in jail for a blinker
No one should
unless
end
you
up
punch
dead.
a cop or
No one
something,
should end up
right?
dead from a blinker.
And that's what he's investigating. So that's why I'm excited to see where this goes, because I know that that's going to come around again, and he's going to attempt to explain how something like that can happen.
Mhm. So part 1. So far,
Okay.
so good.
Mhm.
Gonna keep on digging.
So part
So
2.
We'll see you next week, and we'll see what's next.
Mhm.
For Sierra, for Amy, I'm Rob. We're Painted Porch Strategies. Thank you for being here with us. We look forward to hearing what your comments are too in our mighty networks. Just a little comment. YouTube, just a little comment for us. And like Sierra said, see ya.